The tale of the Battle of Salamis is one of the most extraordinary stories in human history, a story of intelligence triumphing over numbers, of strategy overpowering brute force, and of how the vision of one man could alter the destiny of an entire civilization. The year was 480 BCE, a time when the mighty Persian Empire under King Xerxes I seemed unstoppable. The Persians had already carved an empire stretching from the Indus Valley to Egypt, from the mountains of Anatolia to the deserts of Mesopotamia, and now they were determined to bring Greece to its knees. For Xerxes, it was not only a campaign of expansion but also a quest for revenge, for his father Darius had been humiliated at Marathon when a smaller Greek force had defeated the Persians a decade earlier. Xerxes gathered what was perhaps the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen, an army numbering hundreds of thousands and a naval fleet said to consist of over 1,200 ships, an armada of triremes, transports, and supply vessels that would carry Persian power across the Aegean Sea. Against this immense force, the fragmented Greek city-states seemed powerless. Athens and Sparta were bitter rivals, often at war with each other, and the smaller states of Greece were divided in their loyalties. Some considered surrender or submission, others sought neutrality, and only a few were prepared to resist. But the existential threat posed by Persia forced the Greeks into an uneasy alliance, and at the center of their hopes stood the Athenian statesman Themistocles. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Themistocles was not of noble birth but a man of ambition and remarkable foresight. He had long believed that the future strength of Athens lay in its navy, not in its hoplites, and had persuaded the Athenians to invest the wealth of a newly discovered silver mine at Laurion into building triremes, sleek wooden warships powered by oarsmen and designed for speed and maneuverability. At the time, this decision was controversial, for many preferred the traditional strength of infantry armies, but Themistocles saw what others did not: that Athens, vulnerable to seaborne attack, needed a fleet to survive, and that the Persians, if they returned, would have to be fought at sea. When Xerxes marched his army into Greece, the Athenians realized that Themistocles had been right all along. The Persians burned Athens itself, desecrating temples and driving the Athenians into exile. Many Athenians fled to the nearby island of Salamis, while the Peloponnesians thought of retreating behind the Isthmus of Corinth to make a final stand on land. The Greek alliance was riven with disagreement. The Spartans, who commanded the allied land forces, cared more about defending the Peloponnese than saving Athens, and many of the allies doubted that fighting at sea against such a vast Persian armada was even possible. But Themistocles knew that if the Greeks abandoned the seas, the Persians could land troops wherever they wished, cutting supply lines and bypassing defenses. He believed salvation lay in one decisive naval battle, fought not in the open waters where numbers would favor Persia, but in the narrow straits where Greek seamanship and tactics could turn the tide. Themistocles devised a bold plan. He proposed that the Greeks lure the Persians into the narrow waters between the island of Salamis and the Greek mainland. There, the massive Persian fleet, too large to maneuver effectively, would be trapped and forced to fight ship against ship in confined space. Themistocles argued that the smaller, more agile Greek triremes would have the advantage, and that the chaos of battle in tight quarters would negate the numerical superiority of the enemy. Yet convincing the other Greek leaders was not easy. Many wanted to retreat southward, and morale was low after the fall of Athens. Themistocles, however, combined persuasion with cunning. Ancient sources suggest he even resorted to a stratagem of deceit, sending a secret message to Xerxes claiming that the Greeks were preparing to flee, thereby enticing the Persians to commit their fleet into the straits. Whether or not every detail of this tale is true, the fact remains that Xerxes ordered his armada into the trap, confident that he would annihilate the Greeks once and for all. The morning of the battle was tense. Xerxes had set up a golden throne on the cliffs overlooking Salamis so that he could watch what he believed would be his ultimate triumph. His fleet, drawn from across his empire, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Cypriots, Ionians, and more, was vast and impressive, their oars splashing in rhythm as they advanced into the straits. The Greek fleet, numbering around 300 triremes, seemed pitiful in comparison. But the Greeks had prepared well. Their triremes were lighter and faster, their crews seasoned and motivated by desperation, for they were fighting for their homes, their freedom, and their very survival. Themistocles had drilled them in tactics of ramming and maneuvering, teaching them to exploit the confined waters to outflank the cumbersome Persian vessels. As the Persians pushed deeper into the narrow channel, disorder began to spread among their ships. The sheer number of vessels caused them to collide with each other, oars entangling, hulls grinding together, and the disciplined formations broke apart. At that moment, the Greeks struck. With a cry to the gods, the triremes surged forward, their bronze-tipped rams smashing into the sides of Persian ships. Greek oarsmen rowed with furious strength, while hoplites and marines leapt aboard enemy decks to engage in hand-to-hand combat. The air was filled with the sound of splintering wood, clashing bronze, and the screams of men drowning in the churning waters. Xerxes watched in horror as his mighty fleet began to crumble before his eyes. The Greek ships, smaller and fewer though they were, fought with extraordinary skill. They struck quickly, then backed away, darting through the melee with precision, while the Persians struggled to coordinate in the confined space. Many of the Persian ships, trapped without room to maneuver, became easy targets. Some accounts say that Artemisia, the queen of Halicarnassus and one of Xerxes' commanders, distinguished herself in the chaos, escaping pursuit by ramming and sinking one of her own allied vessels, thereby convincing her pursuers she was a Greek. But such acts of resourcefulness were rare in the Persian ranks that day. For the majority, the battle was a slaughter. By the time the fighting subsided, the Persian fleet had lost hundreds of ships, some sunk, others captured, while the Greeks suffered comparatively light losses. The sea was littered with wreckage and bodies, the water stained with blood. Xerxes, who had come to witness a victory, instead beheld a disaster that shattered his naval supremacy. Though his land army remained immense, without naval dominance it could not sustain itself deep in hostile territory. Supply lines were imperiled, communication was disrupted, and the prospect of further conquest became doubtful. Salamis was not merely a battle, it was a turning point in history. For the Greeks, the victory was a miracle born of strategy and unity. Themistocles emerged as the true architect of salvation, the man whose foresight in building the navy and whose brilliance in luring the Persians into the straits had preserved Greek independence. Without Salamis, it is likely that Greece would have fallen under Persian rule, and the trajectory of Western civilization might have been profoundly altered. The ideals of democracy, philosophy, and artistic achievement that flourished in the classical age might never have had the chance to bloom if not for the courage and cunning displayed that day. The aftermath of the battle saw Xerxes retreating with much of his army back to Asia, though he left a force under Mardonius to continue the war in Greece. The following year, at the Battle of Plataea, the Greeks would defeat this remnant, securing their freedom once and for all. But it was Salamis that had made victory possible, for it broke the backbone of Persian ambitions and restored hope to the Greeks. Themistocles, though later ostracized in the fickle politics of Athens, had left an indelible mark on history. His genius at Salamis was celebrated not only in Greece but also by historians like Herodotus, who recognized the significance of the battle in shaping the destiny of Europe. In reflecting upon Salamis, one must marvel at the interplay of chance and design, of human will and divine favor. The Greeks themselves attributed their victory to the gods, believing that Athena or other deities had guided their hands. But beneath the myth lies the undeniable reality of human ingenuity. Themistocles understood the psychology of his enemies, the limitations of their fleet, and the potential of his own forces. He transformed weakness into strength, turning numerical inferiority into tactical superiority. His strategy has since been studied by generals, admirals, and strategists across centuries as a classic example of asymmetric warfare, where clever use of terrain and timing can overturn the balance of power. The story also resonates because it speaks to the larger theme of freedom versus tyranny. The Persian Empire represented overwhelming might, centralized authority, and imperial domination, while the Greeks, though divided and quarrelsome, embodied the spirit of independence and self-determination. Salamis was not just a clash of ships but a clash of ideas, and its outcome allowed the Greek experiment in democracy and philosophy to continue, influencing the entire course of Western history. From the dialogues of Plato to the politics of Pericles, from the tragedies of Sophocles to the architecture of the Parthenon, much of what we admire about classical Greece was made possible by the narrow escape achieved in the waters of Salamis. As the centuries passed, poets and dramatists celebrated the victory, historians analyzed it, and leaders drew inspiration from it. Aeschylus, who had fought at Salamis, immortalized the event in his play The Persians, the earliest surviving Greek tragedy, which portrays the grief of the Persian court upon hearing of the defeat. In later ages, Admirals like Nelson at Trafalgar or Nimitz at Midway could look back and see echoes of Salamis in their own struggles, where smaller forces triumphed through superior strategy and positioning. Even in modern times, the story serves as a reminder that vision and courage can change the fate of nations, even when the odds seem insurmountable. Themistocles himself did not enjoy an easy life after his triumph. Athenian politics, often ruthless and ungrateful, turned against him, and he was eventually ostracized, forced into exile. Ironically, he found refuge in Persia, the very empire he had once defeated, where he was granted governorship of Magnesia by the Persian king. He died there, far from the city he had saved, a poignant reminder of the fickleness of human fortune. Yet his legacy outlived him. His name remained synonymous with brilliance, foresight, and the power of intellect over brute strength. The sea that had once seemed the highway of Persian conquest had become the fortress of Greek freedom, and it was Themistocles who had engineered that transformation. When we think about the moment Xerxes watched his ships burn and sink before him, one can almost imagine the silence that must have fallen on his golden throne, the disbelief of an emperor who commanded millions but could not bend the narrow straits of Salamis to his will. In that silence lay the collapse of imperial ambition, undone not by equal force but by superior thought. And when we picture the Greeks, exhausted but victorious, raising their voices in triumph amid the wreckage-strewn waters, we hear more than a cheer for survival. We hear the first echo of a freedom that would resonate through the ages, a freedom safeguarded by 300 ships and the genius of one extraordinary man. The rise of the Persian threat under Xerxes and the massive invasion of Greece. When King Xerxes ascended the Persian throne after his father Darius, he inherited both a vast empire and an unfinished mission. Darius had attempted to subjugate Greece but suffered a shocking defeat at Marathon, where outnumbered Greek hoplites destroyed the prestige of Persia's army. Xerxes, proud and ambitious, was determined to avenge this humiliation. He spent years gathering resources, recruiting soldiers from across the empire, and assembling a fleet that dwarfed anything the Greeks could muster. Ancient accounts describe his army in the hundreds of thousands and his navy in excess of 1,200 vessels. Though numbers may have been exaggerated, the force was undeniably colossal. The Persians had no equal in terms of sheer size, logistics, and resources. Their empire stretched from the Indus to Egypt, and now Greece was to be brought into submission. Xerxes crossed the Hellespont on pontoon bridges, a spectacle of imperial might, and advanced through northern Greece, forcing many states to surrender. Against this tide of conquest, the fragmented Greek city-states seemed helpless. Yet in the face of overwhelming power, a spark of resistance remained, led not by numbers, but by determination and cunning. The Persians' greatest strength was their size, but it also became their weakness. Themistocles' foresight in building Athens' naval power before the war. Long before Xerxes set his sights on Greece, Themistocles of Athens had already envisioned the importance of naval dominance. Athens was not always a maritime power, but fortune changed when rich silver deposits were discovered at Laurion. While many Athenians argued the wealth should be distributed among the citizens or invested in hoplite forces, Themistocles urged them to build ships instead. He foresaw that the Persians would inevitably return, and when they did, their strength would not lie solely on land but in the sea. Triremes, sleek wooden warships with 3 banks of oars, became the backbone of Athens' defense. Each carried trained crews and bronze rams on their prows, designed for speed, agility, and striking power. Many criticized Themistocles at the time, accusing him of wasting resources, but events soon vindicated his vision. By the time Xerxes invaded, Athens possessed one of the strongest fleets in Greece, giving the Hellenic League its most vital tool of survival. Without Themistocles' insistence on naval power, the Greeks would have been unable to contest Persian dominance at sea. His foresight did not just save Athens, it laid the foundation for one of the greatest naval upsets in history. The fall and burning of Athens, creating desperation among the Greeks. As Xerxes' massive forces poured into central Greece, the Greek defenders made their stand at Thermopylae and Artemisium. Though Leonidas and his Spartans achieved legendary glory at Thermopylae, their resistance could not stop the Persian advance. Soon, Xerxes reached Athens itself. The city had been evacuated, its people ferried to the island of Salamis or other safer regions. The Acropolis, once a symbol of Athens' pride, was set ablaze by Persian torches. Temples were desecrated, statues toppled, and smoke billowed across the land. The destruction of Athens was a psychological blow that shook the Greek alliance. Many allies questioned whether resistance was even possible against such a juggernaut. Morale plummeted, and voices grew louder in favor of retreating south to defend the Peloponnese. Yet this devastation also hardened the Athenians' resolve. They had lost their homes, but they had not lost their spirit. For them, the battle was no longer about wealth or politics, it was about survival, vengeance, and reclaiming their honor. The sight of their burning city filled the Athenians with fury, and under Themistocles' guidance, they were prepared to fight not with despair, but with determination. The ashes of Athens fueled the fire of resistance. Divisions among Greek city-states and Themistocles' leadership in uniting them. The Greek city-states were notorious for their rivalries and quarrels. Sparta and Athens often distrusted one another, while smaller states shifted loyalties based on convenience. The Peloponnesians argued for retreat and building fortifications across the Isthmus of Corinth, abandoning central Greece to the Persians. The Athenians, however, had no land left to defend. Their city was already in ruins. Tensions nearly tore the alliance apart. It was in this crisis that Themistocles proved not only a strategist but also a master diplomat. He reminded the allies that retreating behind walls would doom them, for Persia's fleet could land troops anywhere and bypass defenses. He persuaded them that a decisive naval battle offered the only hope. His words carried weight because Athens had supplied the majority of ships for the alliance. Without the Athenian fleet, the Greek navy would collapse, so Themistocles held a strong bargaining position. Through persistence and persuasion, he steered the alliance toward his strategy of confrontation at Salamis. In a coalition plagued by mistrust, he was the steady voice of confidence, binding rivals together under a common purpose. Without his leadership, the Greeks might never have stood united long enough to face Persia at sea. The strategy to lure the Persian navy into the narrow straits of Salamis. Themistocles understood that in open waters the Persian fleet's numerical superiority would be overwhelming. Their 1,200 ships could easily encircle and crush the smaller Greek fleet. But the geography of Greece offered opportunities. The narrow straits of Salamis, lying between the island and the mainland, provided an arena where the Persians' size would become a liability. In those confined waters, ships would struggle to maneuver, formations would break down, and collisions would be inevitable. Greek triremes, fewer in number but more agile, could exploit the chaos, striking with precision and retreating before enemy reinforcements could react. Themistocles knew that if he could force the Persians into these straits, he would transform their strength into weakness. This plan was risky. It required the Greeks to hold their ground despite fear, and it relied on convincing Xerxes to commit his massive fleet into the trap. Yet it was precisely this kind of bold, unconventional thinking that defined Themistocles. He realized that battles are not won by numbers alone but by exploiting terrain, psychology, and timing. Salamis would not be a contest of size, but of strategy, and the trap was set. The use of deception by Themistocles, sending false messages to Xerxes. To draw the Persians into the trap, Themistocles employed a daring act of deception. According to Herodotus, he secretly sent a trusted servant, Sisinus, to the Persian camp with a message claiming that the Greeks were on the verge of disunity and preparing to flee. He advised Xerxes to strike quickly before the enemy escaped. Xerxes, eager for a swift and glorious victory, took the bait. Believing the Greeks divided and desperate, he ordered his fleet to block the exits of the straits during the night, intending to trap the Greeks inside. In reality, it was the Persians who were entering the trap. This act of cunning shifted the balance of the war. By manipulating Xerxes' pride and overconfidence, Themistocles transformed his enemy into an accomplice of his own downfall. Few leaders in history have wielded deception so effectively, combining intelligence, timing, and psychological insight. Themistocles proved that victory often belongs not to the strongest, but to the shrewdest. His false message set the stage for one of the greatest ambushes in naval history. The overconfidence of Xerxes and his decision to commit 1,200 ships. Xerxes had every reason to be confident. His armies had crushed resistance at Thermopylae, Athens lay in ruins, and his fleet vastly outnumbered the Greeks. To him, victory was inevitable. When he received word that the Greeks were preparing to flee, his pride and impatience overcame caution. He ordered his 1,200 ships into position, confident they would corner and destroy the smaller Greek fleet at dawn. The Persian king even arranged a golden throne on a hillside overlooking Salamis, determined to watch the spectacle of his triumph. But his overconfidence blinded him to danger. He underestimated the resolve of the Greeks, the cunning of Themistocles, and the difficulty of maneuvering such a massive fleet in confined waters. Xerxes thought he was orchestrating a grand finale. In truth, he was marching into a snare. Overconfidence has undone many great rulers, and for Xerxes, the price of arrogance would be the destruction of his fleet and the collapse of his ambitions in Greece. The positioning of Xerxes on his golden throne to watch the expected victory. The image of Xerxes seated on his golden throne overlooking Salamis is one of the most dramatic moments in ancient history. From his elevated position, the great king expected to witness the annihilation of Greek resistance. To him, the battle was a formality, a display of Persian supremacy to be recorded for posterity. He was so certain of victory that he had scribes ready to record the names of commanders who fought bravely, expecting only triumph. Instead, he became a spectator to disaster. As his ships collided, sank, and burned, the great ruler of the largest empire on earth could do nothing but watch. The irony of the scene is striking. A king who commanded millions was powerless against the cunning of one man and the skill of 300 ships. Xerxes' throne became a seat of humiliation, and his presence on the hill magnified the psychological impact of defeat. His soldiers and sailors knew their king was watching, and as chaos consumed them, their fear turned to panic. Xerxes witnessed not a spectacle of victory, but the unraveling of his grand campaign. His throne on Salamis became the symbol of imperial pride brought low. The geography of Salamis and why the straits favored the Greeks. Geography played a decisive role in the outcome at Salamis. The straits between the island and the mainland were narrow, twisting passages that limited maneuverability. A large fleet entering such waters risked congestion, confusion, and collisions. The Persians, with their sheer numbers, could not deploy their full strength. Instead, their ships crowded together, oars entangled, hulls grinding, and formations collapsing. The Greeks, with only around 300 triremes, had just enough space to maneuver effectively. Their vessels were lighter, faster, and handled with greater discipline, allowing them to exploit the congestion to strike and retreat with precision. Geography turned the battlefield into an ally of the Greeks, amplifying their strengths and exposing Persian weaknesses. Themistocles had chosen the location masterfully, ensuring that the terrain itself fought on his side. History is filled with examples where geography shaped destiny, and Salamis remains one of the clearest demonstrations. It was not brute force but intelligent use of the environment that decided the fate of empires that day. The disciplined Greek triremes versus the overcrowded Persian fleet. Greek triremes were not just ships, they were extensions of the men who rowed them. Each trireme carried about 200 crewmen, many of them free citizens with a personal stake in victory. Their discipline and training allowed them to operate with precision, even in the chaos of battle. By contrast, many Persian crews were conscripts from across the empire, speaking different languages, with little cohesion or shared purpose. In open waters, the Persians could rely on numbers and sheer mass, but in confined straits, discipline mattered more than size. The Greeks executed coordinated ramming maneuvers, striking Persian ships at their vulnerable sides, then withdrawing before counterattacks could land. Meanwhile, the overcrowded Persian fleet became its own worst enemy. Ships collided, oars tangled, and commanders struggled to maintain control. Instead of overwhelming the Greeks, their numerical superiority became a hindrance. The disciplined few triumphed over the disorganized many. It was a classic example of quality outmatching quantity, where the human element of training, motivation, and cohesion outweighed brute numbers. Themistocles had trusted in the discipline of his oarsmen, and they delivered beyond expectation. The battle itself. Chaos, collisions, and Greek ramming tactics. At dawn, as the sun glimmered on the waves, the Persian fleet advanced into the straits, their ships crowding tightly together. The Greeks, chanting prayers to their gods, surged forward in disciplined lines. The first collisions were thunderous, bronze rams splintering wooden hulls, water flooding enemy decks. The Persians, trapped in confined waters, struggled to turn or retreat. Greek triremes darted between them, striking at vulnerable flanks, then slipping away before counterattacks could form. The sea soon became a maelstrom of wreckage and bodies. Shouts in dozens of languages filled the air, mingled with the screams of drowning men and the crash of oars snapping. Smoke rose as ships caught fire, and the narrow straits turned into a graveyard of Persian ambition. Amid the chaos, Greek marines boarded enemy vessels, engaging in brutal hand-to-hand combat, while archers rained arrows on packed decks. What Xerxes had expected to be a spectacle of Persian triumph became a nightmare of confusion. The Persians, great fleet, mighty in numbers, was collapsing before their eyes. Acts of individual heroism, including Greek marines boarding enemy ships. While strategy determined the framework of battle, individual heroism filled its story. Greek marines, armored with bronze helmets and shields, leapt onto enemy decks with reckless courage, cutting down opponents and seizing ships. Many Athenians fought with the memory of their burning city seared into their hearts, channeling grief into fury. There were also stories of remarkable figures on the Persian side, such as Artemisia of Halicarnassus, the only female commander in Xerxes' fleet. She displayed extraordinary cunning, escaping pursuit by ramming and sinking one of her own allied vessels, convincing her Greek pursuers she was friendly. Xerxes himself is said to have praised her boldness. Yet such instances of brilliance could not overcome the overall disaster. The heroism of the Greeks was amplified by their desperation. They had nowhere to retreat, no homes to return to if they lost. Every act of valor was fueled by survival. The individual courage of marines and sailors transformed Themistocles' plan into reality, as countless small victories on ship decks accumulated into a decisive triumph over the Persian armada. The collapse of Persian naval strength and the panic in their fleet. As the battle raged, Persian losses mounted. Ships sank faster than replacements could engage. The narrow straits, once thought to trap the Greeks, became a coffin for Persian hopes. Panic spread among their ranks as collisions and confusion multiplied. Commanders shouted contradictory orders, while oarsmen, exhausted and terrified, struggled to maintain discipline. Many ships fled or drifted aimlessly, only to be rammed by Greek pursuers. The psychological blow was immense. Xerxes had believed his fleet invincible, but as he watched ship after ship sink, he realized the battle was lost. His naval supremacy, the cornerstone of his invasion, had been shattered in a single day. Without control of the seas, his army on land was vulnerable, cut off from supplies and reinforcements. The collapse of Persian naval strength was not just a tactical defeat but a strategic catastrophe. From that moment onward, Persia's dream of conquering Greece was doomed. Salamis marked the turning point, and panic among the Persian sailors foreshadowed the retreat of the great king himself. The aftermath. Xerxes' retreat and the strategic turning point in the war. After the disaster at Salamis, Xerxes' confidence evaporated. His once mighty fleet was crippled, and though his land army remained vast, it could not operate deep in enemy territory without naval support. Supplies and communication lines were at risk, and the prospect of further conquest dwindled. Xerxes withdrew with much of his army back to Asia, leaving his general Mardonius behind with a smaller force to continue the war. The following year, the Greeks defeated Mardonius decisively at the Battle of Plataea, securing their independence once and for all. But it was Salamis that had made this possible. By destroying Persia's naval superiority, the Greeks ensured the survival of their cities and their culture. The victory restored morale, proving that the empire of Xerxes could be beaten. It was more than a battle, it was a turning point in history. Had Salamis been lost, Greece would likely have been absorbed into Persia's empire, and the legacy of democracy, philosophy, and Western civilization as we know it might never have emerged. Themistocles' legacy as a brilliant strategist and savior of Greece. Themistocles did not end his life in glory. Athenian politics, often ruthless, turned against him, and he was eventually ostracized, forced into exile. Ironically, he later found refuge in Persia, the very empire he had once defeated, serving as governor in Asia Minor until his death. Yet his legacy transcended personal misfortune. History remembers him as the savior of Greece, the visionary who foresaw the importance of naval power, and the strategist who outwitted an empire. His genius at Salamis became a model for generations of military leaders, demonstrating how intelligence, deception, and terrain could outweigh numbers and brute strength. More than that, Themistocles ensured the survival of a civilization whose contributions, democracy, philosophy, literature, and art, would shape the world for millennia. Without him, The achievements of Athens, from the Parthenon to Socrates, might never have existed. Themistocles' name endures as a testament to the power of foresight and the brilliance of strategy. His trap at Salamis was not merely a naval victory, it was a moment that preserved the foundations of Western civilization.